My name is Emily Delaney. My father, Gregory Delaney, was the owner and founder of Delaney Enterprises. Company had been thriving for years, moving from one success to another. But back then, there was something in the air that hinted everything was about to fall apart. My father had always been determined and strong, but in recent years, things had started to go seriously off track. He had withdrawn into himself, becoming more isolated with each passing day. One day, as I sat in my father's office, I realized the deadlock we were in. The worried expression on his face was a sign that he was on the verge of losing everything. My father had once been unshakably strong, but that day, when he noticed me, something began to shift between us. "Emily, do you know what we need to do?" he said, gazing out of his office window. His usual stern demeanor was there, but this time it was tinged with weariness. "Dad, yes, I do," I replied firmly. "I can get the company back on its feet. With investors, new strategies, there are so many things we can do. We just need to take the right steps." My father looked at me in silence for a moment. In that instant, I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen in years. Desperation. He had realized something, though I wasn't sure what it was. "I admire your courage, Emily," he said slowly. "But these things aren't easy. I'm not sure if someone like you can shoulder such a heavy burden alone." But I was sure. Deep inside, I felt an overwhelming conviction. I could save my father. I could save our family. I could bring the company, everything we had, back to its former glory. "Dad, I'll do it. I can make this work," I said. Every word I spoke was filled with determination. As I watched my father, I knew this was my chance. I felt the strength within me to save both him and our company. And in that moment, I didn't realize that everything had already begun. Whether it was my father's trust in me or perhaps his willingness to let me try as a last resort, it was the turning point. But in truth, I didn't fully grasp what I was up against at that time. A week had passed, and my father gave me more authority in the company. From that day on, whenever I stepped into Delaney Enterprises, I could feel everyone's eyes on me. Some were surprised, others a little jealous. 'Cause for a long time, my father hadn't allowed any woman to have a say in the company. My grandfather, my father's father, had laid the foundation of this business with the belief that women had no place in the corporate world. But I never considered falling out of his favor. I decided to carry on his legacy, but in my own way. As his daughter, my father had always taught me to be strong, to be successful. But at some point, being strong meant merely serving other people's dreams. I, however, wanted to carve my own path. That's why I knew my father needed to trust me with the company, and that was the moment everything had to change. One morning, I found my father alone in his office. Once again, he was fixated on his computer screen with that dull yet anxious look in his eyes. He was also on the phone. As I quietly entered the room, he looked up at me. He didn't say a word, but I knew what needed to be done. "Dad, have you seen the new plan I prepared?" I asked. I approached his desk slowly and pointed to a few files sitting there. My plan was a roadmap that completely shifted the company's focus, outlining new partnerships and modern strategies. For a moment, my father's eyes flickered behind his glasses. He quickly stood up and picked up the file I'd prepared. "Let me take a look at this," he said. But there was still that hint of unease in his voice. "Be careful, Emily. It won't all be that easy." As he reviewed my plan, his expression softened slightly. The company's future could be saved with this plan I'd put together. Yet, unfortunately, I could still see hesitation on his face. No matter how much he wanted to trust me, I realized how hard it was for him to place so much on my shoulders. Over the next week, we implemented the strategies across every department in the company. Sales surged almost instantly thanks to my suggestions. Investors started showing interest again. The company's future was taking shape in my hands. Now I was at the forefront of everything. My father hadn't yet noticed that these successes were the result of my efforts. He was too focused on shedding the burdens of the past. But we were growing so fast that things started slipping out of control. My father seemed to trust me in some way, but he kept cautioning me to be careful. At night, when I was alone, I couldn't stop thinking about work. Everything was moving too quickly. Success, instead of satisfying me, turned into a kind of fear. I had worked so hard to pull the company together, but I didn't even know what my greatest fear was anymore. One day, my father spared me only a few minutes in his office. This time, his gaze was stern cold. In a period when I'd been feeling so optimistic, his sudden change in demeanor caught me off guard. "Emily," he said, "the company has truly turned around with your plan. But this isn't the end. It's just the beginning." Looking into my eyes, he finished his sentence. "There's another path for us now. Investors, new partnerships, and your place won't be here. I can't let you run this business." His words echoed in my ears. You know that saying, "a silence cut like a knife"? That was exactly the silence in that moment. I had saved the company, but he was about to turn his back on me and step into the beginning of the end. It was as if my father was determined to take all these successes from me and set them aside. I noticed that the trust he once had in me had vanished from his eyes. "What do you mean, Dad?" I said, my mind reeling in confusion. "I'm the one who brought the company to this point. Didn't you see how hard I worked?" "Emily," he said, his tone growing harsher, "let me tell you something. I can't accept a woman running this company. I thought you should forge your own path, but I have better plans for you. For us, this path is different from what you think. You can't handle a business this big." In that moment, everything slowed down. My father's words echoed in my mind. What did he mean? What would all this effort, all this sacrifice turn into in an instant? But one thing was certain, my father's trust in me was gone. There I was, right in the middle of it all, engulfed in a profound disappointment, as if everything I had slipped away in an instant. That moment, I realized it was all a lie. All my efforts, the countless hours I'd spent working day and night, hung in the air, meaningless. My father's trust in me had vanished in an instant. No matter how successful I was, no matter how strong I became, he still saw me as just a woman. In his mind, just as a man belonged in the business world, my natural place was to be pushed aside. I had saved the company, but it had given me nothing in return. In my father's eyes, there was only disappointment and disdain. So when he said, "I have better plans for you," it wasn't hard to see that he was dismissing all my hard work and casting me aside. That night, as I stood alone in that office, staring out the window, I couldn't gather my thoughts. I had wanted someone to pat me on the back, to trust me, but instead, he had turned his back on me. Success belonged only to others. I had thought, like a fool, that I was writing this story with my own strength. But in reality, it had all been written long ago. The next day, I saw my father's face again, but he wasn't the same person. Whispers circulating around the company's offices had reached my ears. My father had started making new deals with investors. Acting as if he'd never heard my suggestions, he steered the company's future in an entirely different direction. The changes in the company's structure felt like they were designed to erase me completely. One morning, while I was in the office, I noticed a man approaching me. His face seemed familiar. Then I remembered. He was my father's closest friend, someone who had managed business partnerships with him for years. But this man wasn't acting friendly at all. "Emily, has your father told you everything?" he said coldly, a hint of mockery in his eyes. I understood what he meant immediately. My father's trust in me had plummeted to zero. I knew why he was being so cold and distant. The betrayal had been there from the start. My father wouldn't accept my place or my power in the company. He had only allowed me to shoulder the burden. Accepting that I'd been pushed aside so miserably was so overwhelming that I felt a surge of rage explode within me. Despite everything, there was still a flicker of hope inside me. Somewhere deep down, I thought my father might trust me again. But with each passing day, as that trust faded further, I was plunged deeper into a dark path. One day, before heading to work in the morning, I found my father alone in the office. I turned to him and confronted everything that had happened. Slowly but firmly, I had to ask him what he really thought. "Dad," I said, taking a deep breath, "when will you truly acknowledge my strength? I'm the one who brought the company to this point, but you only want to see me as a worker. Do you think you know everything better than I do?" To my surprise, my father turned to me and looked into my eyes calmly. But there was no anger in his gaze, only a cold distance. In that moment, I realized once again how far apart we had grown. "Emily," he said, his voice firm and resolute, "I have other plans for you. You can't think so simply. I want you to understand me. This business won't be led by a woman. Your place at such a high level doesn't fit our family's structure. I'm making the right decisions to protect you." In an instant, the words caught in my throat. My father was implying that his love for me was a thing of the past, that nothing would ever change. While I had thought everything was being rebuilt, I now saw that it had only gotten worse. His words tore open a wound inside me, a wound that, no matter how much time passed, would never heal. As I left the room, I felt all the eyes in the office on me. Everyone was watching the drama unfold in some way, but no one was close enough to comprehend the depth of this betrayal. I slowly closed the office door behind me and was left alone with the rage burning inside. He still saw me as a stranger. Everything, my life, my efforts, had lost its meaning in an instant. From that day on, everything changed. The disdain I saw in my father's eyes felt like a darkness creeping closer with each passing day. I had saved the company, achieved success, but in return, all I got was a sense of loss in his gaze. I was a stranger. Suddenly, no matter how close we had been, the distance between us grew. This estrangement followed me every morning as I woke up and went to the office. But I was aware of it. There was a price to pay for all these changes. That morning, things were different in my father's office. Investors were holding meetings again, discussing the company's growth strategy. But I wasn't my usual self. I was enveloped in a strange silence. My father, working on new deals, turned his eyes to me. But this time, there was neither trust nor the old warmth in his gaze. "Emily, come here," he said. I couldn't quite place the tone of his voice, but it felt like he had decided to end everything. In that moment, all the signals inside me darkened further. It was as if I were watching a disaster unfold. "We need to talk," he said. When he spoke so quickly and harshly, something inside me broke. What was there to talk about? Wasn't everything already clear? As I closed the door to my father's office, I realized nothing was normal anymore. We had been together for so long, and I had done everything to overcome every challenge, but in the end, all I felt was a lost hope and heartbreak. "Dad, what happened to me?" I said, stepping closer. "I've achieved so much, but is this the end of it all?" My father took a deep breath, his face still cold and distant. This time, the hardness in his voice had intensified. "Emily, no matter how hard you work, I can't accept you steering the future of this company," he said. In that moment, there was a crack in his tone. But that crack was now causing me pain. Everything was melting away before my eyes. The success I had created was meant to be under someone else's control. As his words rang in my ears, I felt so clearly that I had to accept the company and its future were now solely in his hands. "I offered you a much better path, Emily," he said. "But this will be the best for you." I don't want to see you at the head of the company anymore." That sentence echoed in my soul like a scream. It was a single statement that erased all the years of love, loyalty, and trust one had given. My father was turning his back on me. Like a killer, and in a way I never expected. He was pushing me aside, leaving me with an unbearable burden. "So, is it all over?" I said, forcing the words out through the knot in my throat. For a fleeting moment, there was a softening in my father's eyes, followed by an emptiness. But unexpectedly, something flickered in that void. Sometimes, to do what's best for the ones we love, we have to push them away, Emily. Suddenly, like a cold wind, the weight of his words crashed over me. The fact that my father had lost all trust in me, dismissing me with a single move. I no longer had anything that was mine. He was taking everything and throwing it away so easily that all my achievements, no matter how great, meant nothing. "Go," he said, his voice laced with cold certainty. "Meddling in the company's affairs isn't your place." In that moment, everything inside me erupted. Somehow, for years, I had lived for my father's approval with every step I took. But he had wiped away everything in an instant, both my successes and our relationship. Anger and resentment built up inside me. I had saved the company, but I had lost myself. That moment, I stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My steps were hard and fast. I was so consumed with rage that everyone's faces seemed to blur before me. Behind me, all I could see was my father's back. There was nothing left for us to share. In that instant, perhaps for the first time, I truly accepted that everything was over. But this was only the beginning. A fire of vengeance had started burning within me. 'Cause I had lost everything to overcome it all, and now there was no turning back. After that day, everything inside me turned into a storm. My father's words echoed in my mind more with each passing day. "Your place isn't here," he had said. He said it so harshly, so coldly, that it felt like it tore into my skin. My father had looked at me not as his daughter, but as a stranger. In that moment, something inside me broke. But that break didn't begin to rebuild me. It grew rapidly, intent on destroying me completely. That break was the beginning of a moment when vengeance took shape in a painfully tangible form. Everyone in every corner of the company knew about my father's decisions. They were the people loyal to him, who trusted him, who had lived by his orders for years. But in their eyes, I had become nothing more than the kid who achieved success. How little they knew me, how little they had felt me. I was no longer just at the head of the company. I had become a figure lost in the darkness within me. My father and the company's legacy had, at some point, turned into mere symbols. To them, Delaney Enterprises was a success rising again in my father's hands. But to me, that success was nothing but a symbol of destruction. Behind every achievement of the company, there was a deepening void in my eyes. In my mind, there was that one sentence from my father I could never accept. "You can't think so simply, Emily." In other words, behind everything, the real goal was to give me more, but never to accept the truth. That moment, as he slowly dismissed all my struggles, I fully understood just how far my father had drifted from me. With each passing day, the anger inside me grew. While investors set their sights on my father's new projects, I came to terms with the fact that everything had an end. But I had to realize something. Having this much power didn't mean understanding the pain of loving or trusting someone. My father had only ever known how to love the company and his power. One night, sitting alone, my eyes wandered across my computer screen. Meetings with investors, contracts, projects. I realized that everything my father was supposed to do, he was actually doing solely for his own interests. But this company was his legacy. So, in the end, everything still fell under his control. One night, at the company's main office, I ran into one of my father's old colleagues, Steve. He was my father's old friend, one of the most trusted names in the company. But looking at him, he seemed so distant, so different, that the darkness inside me could approach him easily despite being so close. In Steve's eyes, I knew everything had fallen apart. He had once been so powerful by my father's side, but now he was preparing to abandon this whole system alongside him. 'Cause Steve had noticed the mistakes my father made with me, he had begun to see me as a threat. "Emily," he said one evening when we were alone in the office, "your father put you aside. But it's not that simple. Delaney Enterprises is no longer a place you deserve." His words caught in my throat. For a while, I didn't know how to respond. On one hand, I felt Steve's words were true, but on the other, there was a devastating reality behind it all: my father's downfall. He had believed in me, but when he did, he was only looking for a savior. In the end, he thought everything had to go his way. That's why he completely shut me out. This was no longer someone else's fight, it was mine. I could damage my father's most valuable projects, his investments. The heart of the company shouldn't just be shaped by his hands, but by mine too. And to make him lose everything in his eyes, I had to risk everything I had. One day, after meeting with Steve, I made a decision. I would show my father everything. I would show him how he would lose the things he valued most, how he would pay the price for turning his back on me. No matter how strong he thought he was, I was just as strong. He had wanted to cast me out, but just as I had once trusted him, I decided to take action against a father who no longer trusted me, fueled by my anger. This war was no longer just a family matter. It had become the fight of my life. After that, everything changed rapidly. The anger inside me consumed my entire mind one morning when I woke up. My father turning his back on me made it clear that, in the end, I had to be the one in control. Not to save the company, but to save myself. I was at a crossroads. I wanted to show how fragile everything my father valued, every penny, every investment, truly was. That's when I realized all the things my father had seen as successes for years were actually a path to destruction, closer to annihilating him than he knew. For a week, I dug into the company's old data. The debts he'd taken from outside sources, the investments, the way they'd been funneled into risky projects. When put together, it was clear the company's foundation had already been shaken. My father had ignored his mistakes for so long. But I saw everything. I had saved the company, but I had also seen its true face. Now it was time to take everything from him, to make it all come back to haunt him. One morning, I decided to go to my father's office. My plan was crystal clear in my mind. I would make a move that would alter the company's future, pulling it out of the safe zone he'd clung to in the past. This move would strike at his most valuable project, his investors, and all the mistakes he'd made. I knocked on the door and stepped into his office. As usual, he was staring at his computer screen. Every time I came, that same dull expression was on his face. But that day, the loss of trust he felt hinted that this beginning would also be the end. "Emily, you're here," he said, his voice a little colder than usual. "I thought you'd forgotten what I told you. You no longer have a place here." In his eyes, I could see the ghosts of a past that once trusted me. But I was now too cold, too ruthless to chase after those ghosts. Looking at my father with unwavering strength, I silently sat behind his desk. "Dad, you're about to lose everything," I said calmly. "One wrong move and it's all over. I'm the one managing the company's power, its investments, not you." My father's eyes widened in a way he hadn't expected. He had tried to do so much, but now none of it mattered. In the end, it was his own decisions that had led to everything slipping away. His pride, his choice to cast me aside, had caused him to lose control. "What are you saying, Emily?" he said, his voice trembling. "How far can you go? How much does this business mean to you? It meant everything to you, Dad." "But now, for me, it's different," I replied. "This deadlock we're in destroyed my trust in you. Everything melted away in your hands. Now I'm going to end everything you have. The company's future is mine to decide." As I stared into his eyes, I watched the shock spread across his face. In that moment, I thought about how I would destroy all of the past and everything I'd done. I felt so relieved. Everything he thought made him strong was suddenly starting to fear me. I stood up and walked to the door of his office. I was so cold, so determined that I knew there was no turning back. I gave my father one last look and said, "You asked for this, Dad. I'm taking the company from your hands." I slammed the door shut. In that moment, something broke. But this time, I would be the one in control. I would leave behind the destruction the past had burdened me with and forge my own path. I would change every aspect of the company and end my father's dominance over it. Because this was my time. With my own success, I didn't have to follow in his footsteps. I would build both the past and the future with my own hands alone. That night, everything slowly fell into place. After all the changes in the company's offices, even the silence left behind by my footsteps began to satisfy me. My father's trust in me had vanished, but I was turning that loss into my own strength. There was an emptiness inside me, but that emptiness also brought a sense of freedom. Now everything was up to me. Company's future, the investments, the final say on everything, it was all under my control. Yet something was missing inside me, something still isolating me. Though my goal was to take revenge on my father, I was still alone. I spent that night with the company's computers. Every piece of data, every file, every strategic plan my father had trusted and accumulated over the years, they had all become mere tools for me. To an outsider, it might have looked like I'd won a victory, but the emptiness inside me grew deeper with each passing day. The echoes of the trust that had faded from my father's eyes still haunted me. A week later, I made all the significant decisions for the company. I began correcting my father's past mistakes, his failed investments, and his misguided directions one by one. I reviewed the deals with investors and started placing them on firmer ground. But every change, every innovation made me feel something else. These victories I'd achieved had no real meaning. The rift between me and my father had only given me more power, but there was a void in my soul. In the end, his turning his back on me wasn't just about the business world, it was a personal wound. One morning, when I arrived at the office, despite being so resolute and determined, I felt that emptiness even more. I heard my father's voice. It was so close that everything inside me stirred. I realized I could still feel his presence. But the loneliness and hurt he'd left behind were affecting me more than I'd expected. There was a board meeting at the company. My father entered the room with that same old air of leadership. But something was different. He seemed so calm, so distant, that I almost felt everything was coming to an end. The old trust was gone from his eyes. Like a stranger, no matter how familiar, I understood in that moment that everything was starting to unravel. During the meeting, as the investors and executives looked at me, I felt something. There was nothing left in my father's eyes. Instead of acknowledging my successes, he was only focused on the new opportunities ahead of me. But his loss of me had gained him nothing. Because at the end of it all, I was still his daughter. Even though we had carved our own paths, those paths had never truly separated us. After the meeting, I was left alone with my father. As everyone exited the room, he looked at me one last time. That look told me the whole story. There was still hurt in his eyes, but there was also recognition. He was so strong that, despite all this disappointment, he suppressed his anger toward me. There was sorrow within him and pain too. "Emily," he said finally, "is this really what you wanted? To let everything crumble so easily?" "I didn't want this, Dad," I said, feeling the coldness in my eyes. "But I thought everything was just a game to you. Now I'll play my own game." My father shook his head and looked down at the floor. In that moment, I realized how deep his pain ran. But perhaps I needed to accept that pain. 'Cause I was hurting too. Yet this pain was the price I'd paid for revenge. "I wasn't proud of you," he said, looking into my eyes one last time. "But losing you was the greatest mistake of my life." In that moment, our eyes met for the last time. I was filled with mixed emotions. On one side was the triumph, on the other the pain of lost years. But the truth was this: those lost years were never coming back. It was over. The destruction only became clearer when looking back. After my confrontation with my father, everything only deepened the vast emptiness inside me. No matter how strong I felt in that moment, no matter how much victory I thought I'd achieved, there was still something missing deep within. Every new order I established after my father turned his back on me only brought me more loneliness. I was in charge of the company's management, but that control was also dragging me toward the darkest corners of my soul. Revenge had given me the satisfaction of reaching a goal, but in truth, this victory held no meaning. True victory would have been reclaiming my family, but my father, he was now a stranger. As the days passed, the fractures left behind by my relationship with my father followed me at every moment. While I worked on the company's new strategies and projects, I was also left alone with the state of mind this destruction had caused. I had won the greatest triumph, but winning came at the cost of everything. My family, the company, my father, nothing could be undone. Something inside me was melting away, but it came with a kind of acceptance. No matter how successful I became, a part of me would always wrestle with this void. One evening, after leaving my office, I decided to go to my father's house again. This time, my purpose was different. I didn't want to see him just as a father and daughter anymore. I wanted to talk to him as a human being. Company's future, management, investments, all of that aside, what meant more to me than anything was facing my father one last time. But this time, it wasn't about anger, revenge, or past mistakes. It was about filling the emptiness in my soul. When I arrived at his house, I knocked on the door. There was no sound from inside for a while. When he opened the door, I saw that same stern look in his eyes, but this time I couldn't tell if it was from exhaustion or something else. My father gave me a slight nod when he saw me, but in a way I hadn't expected. He opened the door wider and invited me in. "Emily, I wasn't expecting you," he said, his voice a little unsteady. Tired yet still firm. "Why are you here?" "I think we need to talk," I said. In that moment, I realized how much inner emptiness I carried in my eyes. This void was the product of everything we'd been through and all that we'd lost. But I felt that talking to my father might somehow bring an end to that loss. We went inside and sat down. My father didn't say a word. He was so silent that the words between us felt like they were slowing down. For a while, we didn't look at each other. But eventually, my eyes turned to him. "Dad, through all this, I lost the trust one had in you. But that might have been the biggest mistake of my life. Have I really lost you? I'm trying to understand that." My father stayed silent for a few seconds. He slowly took off his glasses and took a deep breath. "Emily, losing you, that might have been my greatest mistake. But sometimes people make too many errors because they don't understand themselves. My past mistakes were my biggest crime." In that moment, what I saw in my father's eyes wasn't just regret. It was also the effort of a broken heart trying to piece itself back together. He had recognized the fractures within him. But he too was acknowledging that after all this time, the distance between us might have grown too vast to bridge. After a few minutes of silence, my father's expression softened further. "Emily, maybe what you believe is right and what I believe is right are opposites, but in this world, being alone is sometimes easier than understanding someone. Losing you, though, that was never easy." Somewhere inside me, all the frustration of those years, my losses, my anger, and everything left behind suddenly took on meaning. Every moment, every feeling I'd shared with my father. What transformed me wasn't just our disagreements, but also the pain we'd endured together. That pain was something that bound us to each other. After a while of silence, my father spoke again, his tone softer. "Emily, maybe with you something should start anew. But this time we need to build the future together, not the past." In that moment, I felt something begin to change. This shift was perhaps something that should have happened long ago. Yet the frustrations of the past still kept us apart. But at least in this silence, we were growing closer to each other. "Starting over will be hard, Dad," I said. "But maybe for anything to truly begin, we first have to accept what we've lost." My father smiled. There was still that old sternness in his eyes, but this time, within that sternness, there was a glimmer of hope, a sense of rebirth. That moment I spent at my father's house was one that healed the deepest wounds within me. I wasn't just confronting my father, I was also facing myself. All those years, the anger and thirst for revenge I had nurtured inside me had made me strong, but they had also distanced me from my humanity. Now I was nearing the end of those feelings. There was an opportunity to mend my relationship with my father, to fill the voids the past had left me with, and to trust each other again. But that would only be possible through understanding one another. Through those quiet moments I spent with my father that night, I woke up as a different Emily. All night, my mind had been spinning with thoughts. Bridging the gap between me and my father should have started long ago. But somehow, waiting this long had perhaps created a chance for us to understand each other better. With time, every loss and failure I had experienced taught me something invaluable. I didn't need to control everything, and sometimes losses were an opportunity to grow. The first rays of morning sunlight filtered through my bedroom window. When I opened my eyes, my thoughts turned not to the past, but to the future. I was standing at the threshold of a new beginning. I believed that everything would work out with my father and that we would rebuild together. But no matter how far we had come, I knew that to trust each other again, we first had to accept what we had lost. As I shaped the company's future, I realized I needed to build my new relationship with my father in the same way. Company shouldn't just be a symbol of success, it should also be a reminder of our bond. Together, we needed to not only make up for the mistakes of the past, but also figure out how to support each other in creating a healthier working relationship for the future. That day, I went to the office with my father again. This time, the old tension was gone. The emptiness inside me had begun to fill. As I approached him, I still felt something was missing, but I was determined to work together and reunite as a family. "Dad," I said as I opened the office door, "I want to start over. Not just with the company, but with everything between us. I really want to move forward together." My father took a deep breath. In that moment, he wanted to let go of all the hurt and regret inside him, but it wasn't that easy yet. Still, the old hardness in his eyes had softened into something gentler. The way he looked at me was so different, it was as if we were finally growing truly close to each other. "Emily," he said quietly, "I know you deserve this, but this path should be one we walk together. I can't forget the past, nor can I forgive you completely. But we can do this together." For a moment, we stood there in the middle of the office. It was a moment we both had to accept. Clearing the past wouldn't be easy, but we decided it was the right path for both of us. Trusting each other as a family, we needed to make a fresh start. As the days went by, working with my father helped the old tensions and hurts slowly fade away. Company's future wasn't just about financial success. What mattered to us was growing closer to each other through this process and truly being able to trust one another. Over time, the place of old losses was taken by a relationship built on stronger foundations. We realized we could trust each other, not just by remembering the past, but by building something new with each passing day. In this process, though everything in the business world wasn't perfect, what I cherished most was the rekindling of my relationship with my father. The company's success became more meaningful. It wasn't just a financial gain anymore, it was a familial triumph. Together, we weren't mourning what we had lost but celebrating what we had gained. In the end, my father and I carved a new path, shedding the traces of the past. We accepted the voids, losses, and regrets within us and managed to grow closer to each other. The company's future was no longer just a business. It had become a symbol of the trust between us. Our journey was a story of rebirth, both in the business world and personally. And so, in this journey of rebuilding as a family, we accepted that everything had begun right on time. Everything left behind in the past became the starting point for the future. After that night at my father's house, everything became a little clearer. The distance between us had narrowed, but putting everything back on track wasn't so simple. The shadows of the past still lingered around us. The new order we had established with my father seemed to be settling on firmer ground, yet the old wounds, though layered with some healing, hadn't fully closed. At work, everything was progressing smoothly. New projects, successful investments, and positive feedback were proving what kind of leader Emily was in the business world. But there was still a void inside me. Company's management was heading toward greater success with each passing day. Yet with every triumph, there was something that felt more like a loss than a gain. I felt a similar emptiness in my relationship with my father. Communication we had built was as strong as our attempts to trust each other again, but something was missing. Something was always missing. One morning when I arrived at the office, an email caught my attention. One of my father's old business associates, an investor who had known him for years, wrote that he wanted to visit the office. This man had been part of many misguided decisions in the past, decisions that caused the company significant losses. But he had also laid the foundation for the trust my father once placed in him. When I heard of his visit, I felt a sense of unease. In the relationship my father and I were trying to rebuild, I realized things weren't as perfect as they appeared on the surface. The day we welcomed the investor, memories of the past came flooding back. My father stood before him, as stern and distant as ever. But me, I wasn't the same person anymore. I had come to terms with that deep emptiness inside me over time and had stepped into a new chapter of my life. Still, those old shadows appeared when I least expected them. During the discussions with the investor, I listened carefully to what my father said. In that moment, I realized that all the decisions lost to the business world had seeped into my personal emotional world as well. With every sentence from my father's old business partner, I could feel the pain, the hurt, and the disappointments of the past. Past had left deep marks not just in the business realm but in our personal lives too. After the meeting, I was alone with my father. The silence between us was deeper than ever. When he turned his eyes to me, I saw more than just his old familiar gaze. There was regret on one side and acceptance on the other. Both of us were trying to live with the shadows of the past. But sometimes, no matter how dark the past was, turning our backs on it was only possible by looking back at it first. "Emily," my father said, taking a deep breath. "I thought everything would get easier from now on. But the traces of the past, they don't fade so easily." "Dad," I said, my eyes welling up. "I want to let go of the past too. But for everything to truly change, we first have to face it." In that moment, the emotional bond between us was tested once more. But this time, we didn't just acknowledge our emotional wounds. We also decided to leave the past behind together without turning our backs on each other. That day, after our conversation, things became a bit clearer between my father and me. Breaking free from the shadows of the past might only be possible by trusting each other step by step. From now on, in the business world, we had to move forward knowing how heavily the decisions of the past weighed on us. But this was also a way to hold on to each other tightly. A week later, my father and I made a new decision. We would start a period where we'd strengthen the company's strategy even further and make every decision together. This decision was a turning point not just in the business world but in our lives as well. Despite the pains of the past, we were slowly rebuilding the trust we had in each other. So much time had passed that we had almost lost the bonds between us. But now, by taking one more step, we were determined to repair those ties. We attended every meeting together and made every decision as a team. This process symbolized our rebirth in a way. Accepting the pains of the past allowed us not only to recognize what we had lost, but also to appreciate the value of what we had regained. Our trust in each other was no longer just in words, it was evident in every action, every step. Company's future was being shaped solely by our decisions, but more importantly, we had finally broken free from the constraints of the past and embarked on a new journey. One morning, when we arrived at the office together, everything felt different. The air seemed cleaner than usual and everything looked brighter. I felt that all the darkness of the past had been left behind. My father turned to me, and behind his old stern gaze, a smile finally emerged. "Emily," he said, "from now on, everything will change. We'll leave the past behind and build the future." There was a new hope in both of our eyes. In that moment, I realized we had shed the burdens of the past and started anew together. Company was no longer just a business. It was a symbol of the life we had rebuilt, reborn together. This time, we wouldn't just succeed. We would overcome every challenge as a family, trusting each other.